Is there any benefit at all to tying your own flies? I mean, there's tyers out there who can put more flies together in an hour than I can in a day. And all that fly tying stuff costs quite a bit of money. Wouldn't it just be better to buy flies instead? From a purely economic standpoint, maybe. But if fly fishing were about good financial decisions, none of us would be doing this. So let me ask you a question instead. If fly tying were shown to actually improve your results on the water, would you give it more thought than maybe you have already? This week on Untangled, I'm going to show you exactly how and why tying your own flies can make you a better angler. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Excited to be back for yet another week of podcasting excellence. As always, it's just a treat to be here and get to chat with y'all and interact with y'all every single week. I love it. Thank you guys for everything you do to keep the show moving forward. Couldn't do it without you. My first experience with fly tying came when I think it was 14 or 15. And my dad had tied flies when I was a kid. I watched him do it growing up. And he sold a few flies as well back then. And I remember I would just sit and watch him for hours and hours. And he would always tell me, don't touch my fly tying stuff, which, yeah, that's what you're going to tell a kid, right? But it was the only time that I actually listened to him. I think growing up, when he told me don't touch the fly tying stuff, I actually didn't. So Dad, if you're listening, that was, again, one of maybe the only time that I actually listened to you, but I did. So something got through to me eventually. Well, when I'd really jumped into fly fishing, I ended up running through most of the flies in my dad's box. So I was out of flies. I remember one Saturday, I went and got all the fly tying stuff out of the basement because he'd quit tying by then. He got so busy with some other jobs he was doing. So I bring all the fly tying stuff up from the basement one day. I set it on the kitchen table and I said, Dad, you're going to teach me how to tie a daggum fly. And to his credit, we sat down right there and did it. My mom, I remember her rolling her eyes and saying, oh, you guys are going to make such a mess. You don't have time to do this right now. But, you know, bless my dad. He's like, nope, we're doing it. We sat down, we did it. And he actually taught me how to tie a muddler minnow to start. I don't know why that was the first pattern that he picked, but that's what he taught me how to do. And then a week later, after I kind of figured out a muddler a little bit, I was trying and failing at tying up elk hair caddis flies. And I still kept at it, and I would tie a few, and then I would go get on my bike, grab the fly rod, and go up the canyon and try and catch fish on these flies that I tied myself. And it took a while, because the first one that I caught on a fly I tied myself, I don't remember how old I was, but I had to have been at least 16, because I remember I drove myself to the creek that day. I didn't ride my bike anymore. And I certainly was not breaking the law and driving before I was 16 years old. I certainly wouldn't do that. Not an upstanding citizen like myself. I mean, look at me. What I enjoyed, though, was I got a lot of satisfaction of catching that first fish on the fly I tied myself. It was like a 6 or 7 inch rainbow, but I remember exactly where I was standing. I remember exactly how big the fish was, what it looked like. I think it was early winter. It was one of the last days that the creek would even fish that year. There was snow on the ground, and I was so stinking proud of myself. And my dad was too. I showed him the fish. Again, the 6 or 7 inch rainbow trout. Nothing to write home about, but it was so satisfying. And it still might be the most satisfying fish that I've caught to this day, of all the places I've been lucky enough to go and all the fish I've somehow put into the net. That one still stands out in my mind as a really big accomplishment because it was on a fly I made myself. And I've always been drawn to creating and to building stuff with my hands. I did a lot of woodworking as a kid. I still do. So learning to make my own flies, learning to tie was an extension of my personality. And it still is. I still tie. I still enjoy it quite a bit. But I also understand that when I talk about this, not every angler is going to feel that way. They don't get that satisfaction. So if I just tell you, well, it feels good to catch fish on flies that you tied yourself, it's not always a really legitimate reason to go ahead and do it, especially with the startup costs that are involved. You need a vise, you need hooks, you need thread, you need feathers, all the other materials. You can't just go drop $100 and get started. You usually have to spend a little bit more than that. And then you're committing the time to learning it. There's a lot that goes into tying flies. And I think that scares off a lot more would-be tiers than anything else, is the commitment, not just financially, but everything. Time, headspace, learning. It requires a level of buy-in if you're going to do it. And that scares some folks off. And to top that all off, it's really hard to find a crystal clear guide of, hey, these are the materials you need. You don't need this stuff. This is how you get started. This is the simplest, the cheapest, the most effective way to get started. And that's actually why we put together, and I say we, Alex put together our fly tying masterclass. It's on YouTube. I'll drop a link in the show notes if you want to check it out. But it does exactly that. It is the crystal clear guide of, this is what you need. This is how to start. Here's a comfortable, simple way to get started. And that's why we put the fly tying masterclass together. But even with that resource, there's still a hurdle of trying to buy all the supplies and of making sure that you've got everything you need and that you're set and that you can actually enjoy it. And that's actually, we've been trying to solve that problem for years here at VFC. That's one of the things we want to help anglers do, is for those who want to tie, we want to make it as simple as possible to get started. And, we've kind of done that with our starter packs a little bit, where, hey, we've got these, you buy this and it's everything you need. You can go out and get fly fishing right now. And we're doing that. We've got our fly tying mega kit. It's going to have the vise. It's going to have the tools, all the materials, and just a programming note for folks who followed along. The vise is going to be ready, fingers crossed, in 2026. We've got a few more kinks to work out, and then it's going to be good to go. But we're actually going to start dropping some material packs as well, so you can just go buy the stuff you need to tie a certain fly pattern, and you don't have to buy an entire chicken's worth of feathers or a whole spool of this one wire that you're only going to use for this one pattern. You can just go grab the stuff. It's pre-sorted. You don't have to sift through the fly shop or trying to understand the catalogs. No confusion. You just grab the pattern you want to tie, grab the tying pack, and you're set. We've actually just dropped our first one. We'll be dropping a few more of them in the coming months. I'll throw a link to those as well in the show notes if you're interested, or there'll be a QR code somewhere here on the screen if you want to take a look at it, and if you're watching the video podcast. But anyways, I get into all of that not to toot our own horn and say, oh, we're doing great stuff. I get into all of that to say, I understand that it's tough to get started in this. I understand there's a startup, not just a cost, but an investment, mentally and time-wise to get started. And I understand that even when we try to make it simple, there's still going to be a lot of folks who bristle at it and think, well, is it really worth my time? Should I be tying flies, or should I be out on the water working on my cast or working on my mending or getting a better drift? And those are all valid concerns to have. And I don't think it's wrong to feel that way or to think that way. But to get us back on track to that, even with whatever resources you decide to use, if you get into tying, is that still enough to convince you that, hey, fly tying is a legitimate use of your time? And it is. Beyond just, well, it feels good, it feels satisfying to catch a fish on a fly you tied yourself, there is some more benefit to it. And I'm going to illustrate that with a little story. A couple of years ago, I was in Yellowstone, mid-October. We were on the Firehole River. It's one of those real windy, snowy days you get in Yellowstone. It was freezing outside, but the Firehole is always nice and toasty. So we waded into the river, and even with as cold as it was outside, there's a really nice blue-winged olive hatch coming off. And if you've ever fished the Firehole, you know that there's so much pressure on that little river. Tons of people fishing it consistently, and the fish aren't huge either. So when you go out there and you fish it, you're getting refused by like 10 to 12 inch brown trout, it's really humbling. It's a really good ego check sometimes. But anyways, the blue wings start coming off, and I just go with my customary rig of a parachute up front with a sparkle done behind it. That's how I like to fish my mayfly hatches. But I noticed that the blue wings that were hatching, they were a little bit lighter olive in the body than any of the bugs I had in my box. Not by much, but enough that I noticed it and I thought, I haven't seen them this light before. That's interesting. And I fished for about a half hour with that rig, feel confident in it. It's the same setup I use for any mayfly hatch, and the fish just refused my flies. I got a lot of fish coming up and looking at it and then going back down. So that told me there was something wrong with something. So I said, okay, presentation's probably the issue. So I sized down tippet. I made sure my casting angles were great. I made sure I didn't have any drag, and the fish were still refusing the flies. So at that point, with it being such a heavily pressured river, I said, okay, maybe there is an issue with the flies themselves. Maybe they're too big. Maybe it's the wrong color. So I finally decided to switch the flies up and opened my box, looking around for an idea, and I found like 3 or 4 orange-bodied sparkle duns. I have no idea why I tied them orange. I don't know what possessed me at the tying bits that night. I just remember that I did it, and I decided, you know what? These are the only flies in my box that are a lighter shade than anything else. So I'm going to use them. I'm just going to tie them on. They're just a little bit lighter than the olive-bodied ones I had. So I throw it out there, and I think it was first or second cast with that lighter orange-bodied sparkle dun. Fish on. And I got into pretty consistent action until the hatch ended. Now, that's an example of kind of getting lucky with my tying. Sometimes you do just do something ridiculous at the bench, and then it works really well. But often you can be a lot more intentional with it. You don't just have to depend on luck and hope that it works out for you. Now, by that, what I mean by being intentional is you can go ahead and go and observe what bugs are hatching on your local river, and then you can tie flies up to match them specifically. So you know you've got the absolute best fly that you possibly could put in front of those fish. Then all you got to do is make it look real. Okay. For example, there's a drake hatch of some kind here on my local creek, and they're a brownish gray drake. They're about a size 12, but most of the brown or gray drake patterns that I see online that I've tried to tie myself or that I've bought, they're all just a little too thick through the tail, or the color is off just enough. So I decided I wanted my own version of them just to really dial in this hatch, because when the drake hatch starts coming off, the fishing's ridiculous, and it's ridiculous for a couple of weeks. So I really want to get a fly that'll work consistently through the hatch. So I've tied up my own versions. I did that this year, and they were great. I was able to really catch some beautiful, nice fish during that hatch. It's just something that felt, again, very satisfying to me, but I ended up catching more and better fish during this hatch than I did a year before, when I didn't really pay much attention to those drakes coming off. So that's the most obvious top-level benefit with tying your own flies, is you can tie up a fly that solves any problem on any water. And in my opinion, that makes tying worth it. Even if you're not an expert tyer, your flies don't need to look like Tim Fladler's or Tom Rosenbauer's, right? They tie beautiful, beautiful flies. They don't need to look that good. They just need to look good enough. And in fact, a lot of times, the flies that are a little bit messier, that are a little bit buggier looking, end up being a bit more effective anyways than the very clean ties, just because they look a little bit more natural. Okay. So that's one reason. But I also I'm going to borrow from my friend Dom Swintoski over at Trout Bitten, because he wrote this a while ago about tying your own flies, and I really like how he puts it here, just to drive this home. He said, in the beginning, we choose a fly with some measure of hope. Maybe a friend recommends the pattern, or perhaps we see it on a list of go-to flies written on a fly shop's dry erase board. If we're lucky enough to have some success with the pattern, we go back to the vise and change a thing or two. Maybe the gold rib is a bit too flashy, so we substitute it with copper. We might decide to dub the body in a slimmer profile, thinking it's a more accurate match for the nymphs we find living among the weedy limestone rocks of our home water. And when those changes work, when more fish come to the net, our hope for a fly changes to faith. I really like how he puts that together, is your confidence in the flies when you tie them and you know they're a good match skyrockets. And I'm a firm believer that the better you feel about your flies, the better you fish them. It's impossible to quantify. It's impossible for me to do a video about it and to show you concrete, this is how much differently a fly looks and feels on the water when someone who believes in it is fishing it versus somebody who doesn't believe in it is fishing it. I don't know how I would ever quantify that for you, but I can tell you from personal experience, fishing flies that I believe in, that I've got a great deal of confidence in, I fish those so much better. I catch a lot more fish than flies that I'm kind of, I don't think this is going to work. There is an intangible factor there that does come into play. So, all right, you match flies to your specific environment. That's cool. All right, Durant, that's great. But yeah, how does that make me a better angler? What does that do for me? Well, aside from the obvious, you're going to have that increased confidence. It also ties back to one of the fundamentals of fly fishing that we preach here at VFC, and one that I think is overlooked the most often. And that is, the more you watch, the more you wait, the more you observe the river, the more you're going to learn and the better you are going to become, especially if you take the time to watch and wait before you just charge into the river and start casting. The best anglers are the ones who make observations and then form their plan of attack based off of those observations. They don't try and force the river or the fish to bend to what they want to do that day. They work towards what the river tells them, what the fish tells them to do. And if you tie your own flies, chances are you're going to end up spending a good deal of time studying about aquatic insects. You're going to look at pictures of them or videos of emergers coming out on the water, or nymphs swimming, or dry flies buzzing. And you're going to start noticing a lot of the same things that fish do. You're going to notice that emergers tend to have messy, longer than you would expect shucks trailing their bodies when they are caught in the surface film. You're going to notice that crippled mayflies often lay sideways on the water. They're not straight up and down. You're going to notice that caddis wings are a bit longer than you anticipate, and their bodies are surprisingly stout. They've got a little bit of heft to them. You're going to notice that the bugs twitch and move on the water, and you're going to notice how they twitch and move on the water, and how similarly a mayfly and a caddis nymph look while they're drifting in the current. You're going to notice all of this stuff. They're tiny little things. But if you're not worried about how your flies look, you're often not going to have time to observe these tiny little things. But when you're tying, you're invested in making these flies look as real as possible. You want them to work. So you're automatically going to put more time and effort into tying them and into observing and into learning. So all of that knowledge adds up to you directly getting a much better feel for how the bugs act, how they move, and how fish respond to those movements. And to me, that is the number one reward for tying your own flies, is you observe all this stuff, and it's impossible to not become a better angler when you observe it, you think about it, and you figure out how to use what you took into perfecting your presentation out on the water. When you understand how these flies move, how they sit, what fish are looking for, again, it goes back to that confidence thing where you're adding more knowledge to your toolbox. You can draw on that then in all the different hatches, and you're going to become a better angler, just almost by osmosis at that point. It's hard to overstate the difference that it makes when you know what your flies are supposed to look like and how you fish to try and match that versus just relying on patterns that, maybe aren't dialed into your local fishery, or that, again, that may not completely mimic exactly what you're trying to pull off. Okay, let me frame it another way. How great of a pediatrician could you be if you spent your entire time in med school and residency just reading about babies and books? And I bring it up, she's 8 months old now. Cannot believe where the time went. Holy cow. But, pediatrician, how great would you be if you spent all your time just reading about babies and the first real baby you meet as a doctor is the first baby that you've ever worked with, or your first patient of the day? How are you supposed to know what looks and what feels normal if you've only ever read about it? I mean, sure, you've got knowledge. You're probably smart enough to figure things out and apply it pretty quickly, but the best pediatrician, the one who is going to be booked out and impossible to get into, is going to be the one who's spent tons of time around babies, who's invested in everything about babies, knows all their little quirks, and has all that book learning to back it up. That's going to be the one that, they're going to, that's going to be the doctor driving the BMW or whatever it is. They're going to be the ones making the cash. So similar to that, you can be a good angler without tying your own flies. That's not the only path to being a great angler, but tying your own flies opens up this whole new level of familiarity and skill that you can gain within the sport. And it is a surefire way to level up. It's one of the most effective things that I ever did for my own angling, was really investing myself and my time into tying. Now, with all that said, tying flies, it ain't all rainbows and sunshine and happiness. It's a tough skill to develop. You're going to tie a lot of flies that look terrible. You're going to share pictures of them, and then you're going to cringe when you go back and look 2 years later and think, oh my goodness. There's a cash outlay to get all the supplies. Takes a good deal of time, right? Those are legitimate cons to it. When you just buy flies, all the time that you have to sink into it is picking them out and placing the order or going to your fly shop. It's really not a time sink when you're buying flies. When you're tying them, it's tough. And you may not ever have the ability to tie super small flies or really big streamers. You may, still have to buy those. You may not be able to tie every single thing that you want. I know folks who don't tie super tiny flies. They buy all their small ones. And I know folks who don't tie streamers and they just buy all their streamers. So, you can definitely, there's definitely the pros to buying your own flies. You can go in and get really nice flies. And often you're going to get a lot of suggestions about, different patterns from the fly shop folks. So there's a time and a place for buying flies. I still buy a fair amount of flies. It's just by virtue of I have less time to tie now than I've ever had in my life. So I end up buying a few more just out of necessity. And the last time I went into a fly shop and bought flies, I think it dropped like $100, and I walked out and I only had about 24 flies, which was ridiculous. So there does get to be a point where buying a bunch consistently, at some point you're going to spend more than if you would have just bought the vise and the materials. But then, it comes down to what your time's worth. And even then it's, how many flies do you have to buy versus how many do you have to tie to make it a wash? I don't know. That's why I said, economically, do you buy them or do you tie them? In the long run, if you're going to do this for a long time, tying will probably save you cash, but even then, it's hard to really quantify it. But there is the time aspect and there is the convenience of just not having to tie as well. So hopefully that gives you the information and maybe the nudge to start tying your own flies as well. I think it's worth your while. I think every angler should at least try it and know how to tie a few. It's not a skill you're ever going to be upset about. And then for the anglers who really get involved in it and really fall down that rabbit hole, that's where you're going to see the learning just start to exponentially grow. So if you've all got any other questions or comments about fly tying and this whole process, definitely drop them down in the comments. Let me know. I'd love to help out any way I can with that. But we are going to move on to the Q&A portion of this week's show. Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, there is a link to send those in down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Vince from Georgia has our first question, writes in and says, "Hey Spencer, loving the podcast and the community it has created. I'm brand new to fly fishing, about a month, and I'm absolutely hooked. I can't say the same about the fish I try to catch, but I love it anyway. Right now I'm fishing with a 9-foot 5-weight, but I'm already thinking about adding another rod to expand my horizons. I know you've written a lot about gear. I'd love to hear how you personally know when a rod is the right one for you during a test cast. What are the qualities or feel you look for that make you say, yes, this is the one? Bonus round. I've been using an Orvis bat and kill reel and really enjoy it, but when it comes to reels, they all seem to cover the same basics, size and line capacity. Am I overlooking important differences that matter in a reel, or is it really that simple? Thanks for all the great conversations you bring to the podcast. I'm learning a ton and not tangling as much along the way. Vince, that was a great question. Thank you so much. Fly rods are hard to review because so much what we end up loving about them is subjective. I'll give you an example. Winston's have been my favorite forever. Long before I was ever on the team here at VFC, I've been fishing Winston's for a long time. And that's largely because of the Winston feel, which is an actual marketing phrase they use all the time. To their credit, they should. There is that Winston feel to the rods. What that means, if I had to quantify it, is that the rod should feel light. It should be lively. It should have a progressive action. So it should be fast in close, but slower at distances. It should have a nice soft tip. There should be plenty of accuracy involved in the rod. But what feels light to me might feel heavy to someone else, depending on what rods they've been using and how they fish. So there is a lot of subjectivity, even with saying, well, I wanted to do this and this and this. There's a lot of subjectivity that comes into it. So when I give advice on buying rods to other people or when I'm doing rod reviews, it always comes back to looking at what was the rod built for, and is it built to solve the problem that you're facing? Okay, if you're consistently throwing large hopper dropper rigs from a drift boat, for example, your 5-weight might be just a bit underpowered. So you would probably go looking for a 6-weight that's built for fishing big rigs, big flies from a drift boat. You're going to go that route because the 6-weight probably is going to have a little bit more backbone. It's going to have a little bit more power. It's going to be designed specifically for turning over those bigger flies, maybe, turning those over and fighting the wind, fighting those bigger fish and doing it at distance. Whereas the 5-weight, it can do a lot of things. It's really great at a lot of things, but it doesn't really specialize in one thing. Okay, so you're buying a rod to, again, solve a specific problem. If you find yourself fishing a lot of small dry flies at fairly short distances, you might look at an 8-foot 4-weight, for example, because a lot of 8-foot 4-weights are designed to fish small dry flies at shorter distances. They're designed to have a much softer tip, a much more progressive action, so the flies are going to land softer on the water. They're going to really protect lighter tippets. They're going to do a better job of that than your 9-foot 5-weight will. That's not to say you can't use the 5-weight for everything we just discussed. You can, and it will work. But again, if you are facing this problem consistently and you want to solve it, then you're going to go look for a rod that's built to do those things. And you're picking all these different rods based on what they're going to excel at. So then once you've found, maybe you've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 6-weights that you really like for those big hopper dropper rigs. When you go to test cast them, you're going to play with them. You're going to give them the fly shop wiggle where you move them around and everybody holds their breath, hoping that you don't hit the other rods and break them. You're going to get a feel for what ones just feel good for you and what ones don't. Okay. We talk a lot about the action of a rod, if it's fast, if it's slow, and that just refers to how much the rod bends during the cast. Okay, is it going to bend in the top third that's fast? Is it going to bend all the way through the rod that's slow? There's not one that's right or better. The best rods 30 years ago, they were slow action rods, and there were plenty of amazing anglers catching great fish back then. But there's also nothing wrong with the fast action rods. I don't particularly enjoy them very much, and I don't think that they are the most effective tool for beginners to learn how to cast on, because they generally don't have as much feedback unless you're buying the really expensive ones. But again, that all kind of comes down to subjective and being my opinion. I know a lot of guys who disagree with me on that, who think that fast action rods are the way to go for everybody because they are easier to cast in a lot of ways. So what you're going to end up doing is you're going to end up picking the rod that enjoys the most, that you enjoy the most in hand, that feels the best in your hands, the one that feels most comfortable, the one that you enjoy casting the most. And that's why, I've had the opportunity to fish and own Sage and Orvis and Thomas and Echo and Reddington and Tom Morgan Rodsmiths, and you name a rod brand, I've more than likely had the opportunity to fish it. But I keep going back to my Winstons because I just love the way they feel. I love the way they work. It matches my fishing style. It's just a good fit for me. Now, with all that said, every reason that's just laid out is also why I love our fly flinger here at VFC so much, and why I firmly stand behind it and recommend it to folks who do want that all-around 9-foot 5-weight, because it was a rod built to solve a problem. It was built to be a rod that can be a good all-around 5-weight, that can handle dries, nymphs, light streamers. It's got a nice medium action to it so that you can feel the line loading during the cast, so that you can learn what a good cast feels like or what a bad cast feels like. You got some sensitivity in it. The tip's soft enough for dry flies. It's affordable as well. It ticks all the boxes that you need, but it's not the lightest rod in the world. It doesn't have all the bling of a high dollar stick. It was built to be affordable as well for anglers who want to get into the sport. We wanted something that was good, but we wanted a rod that was trying to think of the best way to phrase this. Sorry. We wanted a rod that was not necessarily built for a price point, but that delivered what anglers needed and figured out where we could, say, well, do we need this really fancy cork? Do we need the nickel silver reel seats? Do we need all that blingy stuff? No, we don't. So let's just focus on a rod that is affordable and that works well and that meets needs of most anglers. And I love it for that. I love the fact that the fly flinger accomplishes those things, and that we can fish it as much as we do, and that we love fishing it as much as we do. So that's it for the rods. As to your question about reels, drag does matter for larger fish, bigger waters. I caught an almost 20-inch fish a few weeks ago, and without a decent drag, I probably would have lost it because it just took off and would have been harder to control without a decent drag to it. Now, that said, I do have a friend of mine, one of the fishiest guys I know. He catches all of his giant trout on a Fluger Medalist, which is an old click pawl reel. So it's just like that bat and kill you mentioned. There's no adjustable drag. It just has one setting and that's it. And I've been with this buddy of mine when he's caught 15-pound cutthroat out of a river on that Fluger Medalist. And it's a sight to behold watching him fight those fish, man. He knows how to palm a reel. He knows how to control his line coming out. So in general, I think reels are overhyped in trout fishing. You don't need $500-$600 reels. I'm not telling you not to buy them. If you want to spend your money on it, go ahead. They're cool. They're amazing feats of engineering. They're light. They're beautiful. They're strong. But all you really need is a decent disc drag that's adjustable and doesn't have too much startup inertia. And that's going to handle 99% of the trout fishing that you get into. The reel that we sell here at VFC, I mean, I've watched Alex catch a 24-inch brown or a 25-inch rainbow on it. That's the one that I caught the almost 20-inch fish on a couple weeks ago. It's more than up to the job handling those fish, but it's not $400 or $500. So again, it's the same thing really with fly rods. You can just get the reel that's built to do what it needs to do. Yeah, is it going to be a little bit heavier? It might not look as cool, but it's going to get the job done, versus get the stuff that's super light and has the crazy machined patterns into it and maybe is hand painted or whatever. You can go down that road and there's nothing wrong with it. But if we're talking about what we basically need, it's just the simple stuff, a decent drag that's going to do the job. So hopefully that answers the question. Thanks a bunch for sending it in. Bryant from Colorado has got our next question, writes in and says, I went fishing, and to set up my rig, I turned over a few rocks, matched the hatch as well as I could, and set up what I thought was a pretty smart rig. I put on a traditional nymph setup with a heavy tungsten TNT followed by a zebra midge on the bottom. After fishing my spot, I would let my rig drift behind me in the water and walk up to the next spot I was fishing. Would you believe I caught a fish? I then proceeded to get bites on that rig not once or twice or 3 times, but 7 times. I was thoroughly confused. I thought Spencer said my flies needed to have a drag-free drift, but here I am walking against the current, my gear being dragged about 10 feet behind me, and I'm getting action on my flies. What's up with that? All in all, it was a good day, and I left the river having caught a few fish, but man, am I confused. Thanks for the podcast and all the content. It's really helped me improve as an angler. Bryant, you found the exception to the rule that we talked about, which is get a drag-free drift, put those flies in front of fish, make them look real. I 100% believe you caught fish. That doesn't surprise me at all. There's this one particular hole that Alex and I love to fish on this one river, and we have caught countless fish because at the end of each drift with a nymph rig, we'll let the flies swing in the current, and as that swing happens, the current grabs them, pulls them downstream of us, and then pulls them up higher in the water column. And that rising movement, it actually imitates an emerging insect. And a lot of times it's going to trigger fish to go ahead and eat the flies because trout love to eat things that are moving away from them. So that movement up and to the surface triggers that very base predatory instinct in trout. And it's often going to result in exactly what you experienced out there, which is a lot of fish going after your flies. So, again, yeah, it doesn't surprise me. Now, we don't fish this way all the time because fish aren't always eating emergers. Insects aren't always hatching and becoming adults. There's lulls throughout the day. Sometimes, like right now, the middle of winter, the only insects doing that are midges, and they're likely doing that, at the warmest part of the day. And again, not every single day is that going to happen. So, a good drag-free drift is more effective most of the time. But if there are a lot of insects starting to emerge or starting to move towards the surface and hatch, that's when the fish are going to be keyed in on emergers, and that's when it would make sense to start swinging your nymphs at the end of your drifts. So what I could tell you to do for the future here is tie an emerger on as the top fly in your nymph rig and fish that a bit higher in the water column. If you're noticing that the fish are eating on the swing, that's when I would say, all right, switch to an emerger on the top fly in your rig. Maybe move your indicator and fish it a little bit higher in the water column and swing it at the end of every single drift. But focused on the dead drift first. Okay, get that good drift through the run in front of you, make it as good as possible, and then let it swing at the end of the drift. And as you move upriver, as you move up through the hole, you're going to be able to swing through the entire hole and maybe get the fish that are going to be triggered by those emergers rising up to the surface. And a dry dropper would be good in that situation too. If you're catching a lot of fish consistently on an emerger, then stick one on as a dry dropper and fish it a lot higher in the water column. Get those fish to come up. You can even throw on a soft tackle, do some wet fly swinging as well. That's always an option. There's nothing wrong with letting your flies swing at the end of every drift. I wouldn't hesitate to do that. But again, just make sure that you get a good drift through the run or the pool or wherever you're fishing. Drift those well first and then swing at the end of the drift. Because just like you experienced, that's sometimes going to be what triggers those fish to eat. I don't default to swinging flies 24/7. I won't just swing flies all day. It's not my favorite way to fish. I've done it. It's just not for me. And that's fine. You may really love it. And that's awesome. I love that it works for you. It's just not my particular cup of tea. But letting my flies swing in the current, that's something I do pretty frequently, letting them swing at the end of every drift, especially when it's summer. I'm throwing a lot of dry dropper rigs. That swing can be really effective sometimes. So thanks for the question. I appreciate you sending it in. Daniel from Norway has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey guys, love your podcast. I was wondering if you ever use split shot on dry dropper rigs. Love from Norway." Daniel, this is a really good question. Thank you. I don't use split shot on my dry dropper rigs, and I honestly try to avoid split shot as much as possible. The reason I don't add split shot on a dry dropper is it's going to make that rig a lot clunkier to cast. So one of the advantages of a dry dropper rig is the fact that it's got some delicacy to it. The dry fly and the nymph will land softer on the water than an indicator, split shot, and nymphs, and you're still able to fish 2 parts of the water column with a dry dropper rig. So when you add split shot to that, you're taking away from some of that delicacy immediately, which, can impact the fishability of your rig in the fact that if the fish are looking up and if they are in lower water or it's very clear, that extra weight of the split shot can spook them sometimes. It can be just enough to let them know that it's not real. And then on top of that, you're going to lose sensitivity in your rig, and it's going to be way easier to tangle when you put split shot on your dry dropper rig. That's Tangle City. Take it from someone who's experienced it firsthand. The reason I avoid split shot and try to just never use it is that when you add more weight to your rig, whether it's, on your leader before the flies or on the tippet in between the flies, you're going to sacrifice feel. You are going to feel more of the weight drifting in the water instead of the fly. So you're going to lose out on some of the subtle bites, some of the subtle hits that trout make sometimes. And then building off of that, when trout go to eat a nymph, if they move up in the water, they eat the nymph and they go to smack it, but maybe that split shot gets hung up on a rock right when they go to eat it. Or maybe that split shot is pulling that fly a little bit quicker because there's so much more weight to it. There's just going to be some unnatural movements sometimes to get introduced with split shot that the fish can feel that immediately. If they go to eat that fly and there's resistance, they're going to spit it out before you even know that they sucked it in their mouth. It just comes in and pops right back out like lightning. It's amazing to see how quickly they can spit flies out of their mouths. So you do lose sensitivity. It can impact the drift. If you just fish with heavy flies, all that weight is just in the fly. So there's nothing pulling the fly. There's nothing potentially hanging the fly up. It's still drifting in the water column. And then when they go to eat it, there's not going to be that weird, maybe hesitation, maybe the something pulling on the tippet and just stopping it from feeling completely natural. You don't get that with just heavy flies. And honestly, that's probably why when Alex ties up his nymph rigs and he does tag ends instead of tying them in tandem, he ends up catching a lot more fish than I do because he's using split shot to get it down, but then he's retaining all the sensitivity by setting his rig up with the tags instead. So I might finally have to break down and try it a little bit more this year than I did last year. The other part of this too is I'll just draw your attention to the point of the dry dropper rig in the first place, which it's not a rig that's traditionally used to put your nymph in the bottom of the water column. Generally, you're going to be fishing those nymphs in the upper 2/3 of the water column. So aside from the weight of the nymph, you really shouldn't need extra weight on the dropper to get it down to the correct depth. You should just be able to have a fly that's heavy enough or big enough to just get down there to where you've set your tippet length. The idea of a dry dropper rig is to target the fish that are looking up, that are actively feeding further up in the water column versus the ones that are all the way on the bottom. Now, in smaller streams, it can be very easy to get a dry fly on top and your nymph on the bottom. If it's only 2 feet deep, that's a piece of cake to do. But even then, you don't want that fly so deep, that dropper so deep that it's catching and snagging and interfering with the drift of your dry fly. You're still going to fish it a little bit higher in the water column than you would if you were doing a 2 nymph rig through that same piece of water. So with all that's the really long answer of why I just don't use split shot on my dry dropper rigs. There's nothing saying that you can't do it or you shouldn't do it. Maybe there's a very valid reason. Maybe there's a very valid situation you find yourself in where it makes sense, but I just try to avoid it at all costs. I want as sensitive a rig as possible, and I want my flies in very specific spots throughout the water column, and I'll just change my technique to do that if I need to. I won't try and shoehorn a rig in to fit that, if that makes sense. So I appreciate the question. Thanks for sending it in. And with that, we are going to move on to the Live Real Life moment of this week's show. Every week, we end Untangled by sharing a story and pictures from folks who are out in the audience living real life. We love to see and hear all about the adventures y'all are up to. It's the reason VFC exists, is for living real life. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment you would like to share with us, there is a link to do so down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Eric, who writes in and says, back in June of 2024, I took a couple buddies and my wife for a day trip up to the San Juan River here in New Mexico. It was a hot day, but the tailwaters of the Navajo Lake keep the water temps at 50 to 55 all year round. The group was doing pretty well for the day, and my wife was out fishing me as usual due to her having more patience than me on most rivers we fished together. As I moved upstream, I spotted a monster feeding in front of a rock on a pretty shallow run. I had adjusted my depth and kept the flies that had been working for me most of the day in hopes to catch this monster. I must have cast this fish for over an hour, throwing everything in my box, from size 24 foam wings to size 10 leeches. I wanted to catch this fish. After getting pretty frustrated and thinking, yet again, I don't know what I'm doing on the river, I changed my bottom fly to a size 18 orange scud and changed positions to cast from a different angle. First cast from this new angle, and fish on. He put on a good fight, and when we finally landed him in the net, we noticed he was blind on his right side, which was the same side I'd been casting to for over an hour. Every time I go out on the river, I think of this experience and how you never know what you're going to encounter out there on the water. These experiences are what I think keep us all going back out for more. Thank you again for the content the Ventures Flyco team is putting out, and keep up the good work. Eric, thanks for the story and congrats on landing the fish, man. That's cool. I really love what you had to say there. You really nailed it. We do go back out there because we never know. Is this the day we catch the monster? Is this the day we do it or not? So I love you sharing that with us, man. Thank you. With that, folks, we're going to wrap the show up this week. Thank you so much for being here, listening and watching to the entire show. That does a lot for us. That really helps the show reach as many people as possible and ultimately help as many folks live real life as possible. That's what we're here for. And if you'd like to help us even more, definitely tell all your friends about VFC. Don't let it go under the radar. Tell everybody. Tell your barber. Tell your mailman. Tell the person loading groceries in your car at Walmart. Tell them about VFC. And make sure you rate and subscribe to us wherever you're listening as well. That helps us a ton too. But until next week, folks, go get out on the water, have some fun time fishing, and live real life.